ongoing revolution in digital and social media, contemporary marketers and entrepreneurs need help. One form of help resides in the effective integration of analytics with strategic marketing thought. Hello everyone, I'm Gary Hunter.
Okay, so the first step then in this STP process is really kind of identifying segmentation variables. So this is sort of like top of mind kind of stuff. You should know, okay, there's lots of ways to think about segments. So you could think about them geographically, you could think about them demographically, you could think about them psychographically, you could think about them in terms of behavioral aspects. One of the tools that you'll learn in this class that we'll use for the Portland Trailblazers case is a tool that's called Conjoint Analysis or Trade-off Analysis. So in Conjoint Analysis, you're basically kind of going out and surveying customers and trying to figure out, okay, what is it that they value most in their season ticket purchases, or how do they kind of go about thinking about those different trade-offs, in terms of like where the seat location is, right? If my seat's somewhere within the arena, am I willing to sort of pay more for that, right? How much more am I willing to pay to be in that seat versus another seat? Those types of trade-offs, is it more, when I'm looking at season ticket packages, is it more about who we're playing against? So you can imagine that if you sort of took and you surveyed a number of people across kind of what they're most interested in. Some people might say, well, I don't really care if I'm in the rafters, as long as it's a good game, that's a higher priority for me, right? Other people might say, well, no, I want to be down close. I love to watch the blowouts and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter, as long as I've got a great seat. So people will make different trade-offs, and you can basically use this conjoint analysis to kind of form segments based on values, right? Like what do people value the most? Because it's sort of getting at sort of different value segmentation. So there are ways to kind of get at segmentation that's much more direct than some of these are. So some of these are often kind of one-off proxies, right? These are sort of like proxies. Do you guys know what proxies are? Economics and stuff. So they're sort of like they're approximating some other factor that actually is sort of driving the decision. So if you can get closer to kind of how people make decisions and group in that way, that's sort of like one of the more effective ways of doing segmentation. Okay, so segmentation relies on this data. So acquiring useful data becomes kind of a focal point. So how do you get useful data? So there's only two ways to get data, right? It's either primary data, you collect data yourself, you design an instrument, a survey, collect the data, or you find it somewhere else. So if you find it somewhere else, then it's probably data that someone has collected for some other purpose. And a lot of times this is driven by your means, your resources. Big companies will do a lot of primary data collection. Small companies will use a lot of secondary data, right? Because it's sort of like there's a huge cost that's associated with kind of administering studies. So a lot of entrepreneurs will use secondary data quite a bit. Okay, so these different statistical tools. So this is an example of some statistical tools. So there are tools called factor analysis, cluster analysis. I just talked about conjoint analysis earlier. So factor analysis and cluster analysis are just tools that are really designed to kind of take in factor analysis. If you have 100 items in a particular survey or a questionnaire, factor analysis is designed to try to say what's kind of the simple structure and the number of items that are there. So are there only, in those 100 items, are there high correlations across respondents in the subset of those items? So can I kind of almost cluster the items together? And in doing that, I'm trying to reduce, sort of the way people are responding to my questionnaire to some set of factors, right? So when that factor analysis will often be done to kind of reduce it down to say, okay, what are the underlying dimensions of this instrument? Then a cluster analysis will be done to kind of do that grouping that I just showed on the previous slide. Like the cluster analysis would be how do people sort of group together within these factors. So I'm often trying to simplify my instrument, right? And then I'm trying to simplify my view of the different segments that exist. So these are just sort of different tools, but they're all sort of trying to get at the same thing that we had talked about earlier. They're basically trying to get at homogeneous segments, right? Homogeneous within and heterogeneous across. Yes.
So factor analysis in that previous slide would have been trying to rank what people find most important in carpet, and then would have been the first step? Like with the factor analysis would have showed you that people like strength and then water resistance and color was way down.
So you can use factor analysis. But so factor analysis in that previous slide, the way factor analysis might have been used would be to get to those dimensions, right? So you may have had like 5 or 6 items that were sort of related to the stream, and you may have had 5 or 6 items that were related to water resistance. So you may have reduced your instrument down to that, and then plotted those dots, each observation, after reducing the instrument down to those 5 on what people's sort of average scores were on those, on that factor. See? So factor analysis is more sort of an instrument simplification technique, right? And you're often just trying to kind of get down to what really matters. And all you're really trying to do is the same sort of thing, but so see the simplicity of it without getting lost in the complexity is really what I want you to get mostly here. But you can sort of layer on the complexity and the sophistication on the statistical side, but seeing sort of that's sort of what's going on behind the scenes is really what's more important at this stage. Okay, so this is sort of the result of clustering, right? So this would be sort of the output. So this is sort of a study is done, a primary study is done on toothpaste, right? So the clustering will kind of come to this whole thing. So the factor analysis here then would be done on sort of the left-hand side, right? Principal, benefit, sought, demographic strengths. Those things would be sort of these dimensions that might kind of fall out of the factors that kind of help to segment the market, right? So these segments then kind of fall out from that. Then you can see kind of within each one of these segments, there's a sensory segment, a sociable segment, a worrier segment, an independent segment. And what these different characteristics do is they sort of describe within each one of those how is that segment sort of different from the other segments, but homogeneous within, right? So this is sort of just a clustering analysis that would get at different segments that you might go after in the toothpaste market. Do you guys think people study toothpaste like this, or not? Or do you think they just sort of threw stuff out there? You probably knew there was something going on, right? There's an enormous amount of analysis that goes into a number of these different consumer products to try to figure out, okay, well, which segments are we really going after, right? Because if we can kind of identify which segments we're going after, how does that then help later? See, as consumers, we see the commercial or whatever, right? Or we sort of see the packaging. Right, but we may not see all this analysis that's kind of going into it, right? So sometimes some toothpastes may be targeted towards worriers, right? So what are worriers looking for on a toothpaste? You go to this, I'm just trying to get you guys to kind of operationalize some of this stuff, right? So you go to the toothpaste aisle, there's going to be all sorts of choices there. If you're trying to appeal to the worrier segment, what are worriers looking for on your packaging? What needs to be salient?
Like cavity protection.
Cavity protection, absolutely. They're worried about cavities. That's exactly it. See, so this is sort of that's. So if you're looking at a different segment, what does your packaging look like?
I buy toothpaste for my $2. They're like fancy ones with cartoon characters.
They're like cartoon characters. Okay, so which segment are they in? They're in.
They're the children.
Okay, children's segment. Okay, very good. So this is sort of what you're trying to get at is that sort of thing. Is how do you kind of operationalize it? So you can see how they would go through those 6 steps we just had earlier. Kind of come up with these different segments, right? And once they kind of come up with these different segments, they figured out, okay, we're going to target these different segments. And then somewhere when you go to the aisle and you start looking for that, you're going to see cartoon characters, right? They're out there, I bet. Aren't they? And there's even probably favorites among the cartoon characters. See so how your segmentation scheme gets more and more narrow, right? You may say, okay, this segment is sort of into what type of cartoon characters are big now. I guess Batman's probably big.
I'm daughters, so they're more of the princess.
Oh, princess! Oh, princess mode. Okay, so it's more princess and stuff like that. Okay, very good. So you'll start seeing different princesses. They'll have favorite princesses, right? So a company might, if the segments are large enough, they might say, okay, we're going to do princesses are these Disney princesses like Ariel and Snow White, that group, right?
Yep.
Okay, so they may have different ones that they sort of like, and so which one of these do we sort of want to put on there to go after these different segments? See, so all this analysis is kind of done prior to that. What do we put on the package? What do we stamp on the package? What do we want to do sort of to try to attract these different segments? And you have to have a feel for just how big is that segment, and is the segment for Ariel big enough to kind of give Ariel her own, stamp, right? And there are other things that sort of come into play, like how much do people forward buy on toothpaste, right? So like the idea of stocking and stockpiling and stuff like that will come into some of those different decisions. So it might be that they can use Ariel for a while and then they switch over and use someone else later, right? Okay, good. So this is sort of what you're trying to. These are sort of the decisions you're trying to get at, right? So, what would make? Well, how do you actually figure this out, though? If you're a marketer, how do you figure out? Do you always have to do it sort of the way we're doing it now, which is almost like pure conjecture? A little bit of stuff in the case. We've got some evidence here and there. How do marketers sort of get at this idea of what do people think about when they think about my brand?
They want to ask people, and they quantify the results from that and try to figure out what are the perception problems they have. They talk on page 9 about 3 primary concerns that consumers have were that innovation would slow down, quality would suffer, and service and support would be outsourced. And so,
okay, very good. So they go out and they ask people, right? What are some of the techniques then that those, what are those called? What are some of the techniques that marketers would use? Besides just asking, like they can't just ask questions, find out something. Is that going to be enough for Steve? Steve needs numbers, right? So how do we get Steve numbers? We do surveys, right? What else do we do? Focus groups. Okay, so those are still kind of qualitative, right?
Perceptual mapping.
We could do perceptual mapping, right? Okay, so see how this totally, what you should see is how this totally plays into exactly the problem they're sort of looking at. You want to see how this is a tool that sort of helps marketers get at the idea of, well, what is it people actually think? So this would be sort of, the way a perceptual mapping study would work is how before I kind of get into slides and stuff, what is perceptual mapping and how does it actually work? I've got handouts of this one as well, so I'll start passing those.
So it's really mapping the perception of the customers about, a certain group of the companies that offer similar products.
That's exactly right. So it's mapping the perceptions that people have of different brands, right? Different brands, different products, right? So perceptual mapping was named by what type of functional experts? Marketers, right? So this is exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of going out and trying to kind of measure perceptions that people have of different brands, and then kind of taking that data and plotting it out so you kind of see how do these brands compare one to another. So this is the kind of stuff that Steve would really like, right? Steve's going to be my quant job. You're okay with that, Steve? Okay, so perceptual mapping is basically kind of saying instead of using all the conjecture and trying to figure out, what do people think when they think of Lenovo? What do people think when they think of ThinkPad? You can sort of do these kind of things the way I'm doing them, where I'm asking you, what do you think of when you think of this brand? What do you think of when you think of that brand? And we get some qualitative assessment, or we could kind of go out and sample some set of a population and try to figure out what does the population think about these different brands. So as you get into sort of the L'Oreal case, that's basically what L'Oreal is sort of doing, right? They're trying to go out and they're doing this positioning research. So this is all about trying to figure out where are we positioned, what do people think about. And positioning is very much related to branding and brand management. You're trying to kind of figure out what are the right ideas to kind of convey to your different market and what do they currently think of. So a lot of times you want to know where are we now. So you can kind of figure out where in the space you are now. So this is sort of like mapping is trying to define space. And the space is essentially going to be defined primarily by these attributes, right? So these different things that you're talking about, like dependability, quality, those sorts of things, leadership, global, regional, those sorts of things are all different attributes that people might have with each one of these brands that you can kind of go out and survey. Where are we in that space and where would we like to be in the future, right? So it's sort of like plotting out where you are now, where would you like to be down the road. So maps are often used to kind of get direction about, where you get from where you are to where you'd like to be. So this really fits in the whole kind of segmentation, differentiation, and positioning idea, right? So you guys kind of are starting to get, I think, a feel for how that whole flow of ideas kind of fit together. So there's a lot of stuff called MDS, multidimensional scaling, that gets into things, but I want you to see sort of just the basics of this, right? So if you just take the basics, and you said, let's look at something like a processor speed and price, and we said those are two of the key attributes that's going to drive purchase of a laptop or purchase of a desktop or something like that, purchase of a computer, right? And we plotted out sort of where people stand on that. So each one of these dots are sort of represent where they stand on how important is processor speed and how important is price. Right? So we might have plots that kind of look like that, and those could represent individuals or segments or whatever. And we might say, okay, well, the segment that we're more interested in is really this one that's kind of up and to the right. So we said, okay, within that segment, what's important to those people, right? So see, this is a different sample. So we kind of sample the population at large. We find out, okay, this is sort of the segment we want to go after. And then within that segment, we find out that 2 other attributes are important. And we sort of say, okay, it's warranty and support. And we might see kind of where people fall within that whole set. So we're often trying to take these complex notions and reduce them down to kind of these 2-dimensional charts or multidimensional charts where we can see from the space where the markets might exist and where people's current perceptions are. Then we're often trying to sort of move from where we are to where we would like to be within that space. So there's different types of input data. Sometimes the data are sort of perceptions and sometimes they're preferences, right? And on the perception side, you have these similarity judgments, and then you have these attribute ratings, right? So you can do sort of in a similarity judgment sort of thing. You're basically asking for which you show 2 things, which of these 2 are most alike on a scale of 1 to 7 or something like that. You sort of get ratings in that regard. So I might show you Toyota and Honda. You know, you might say, okay, on the scale of 1 to 7, that's a 7. It's pretty close to a lot alike. You might say a 6 or something like that. I might show you Toyota and Nissan, and you might say 5 or something like that, right? So kind of do this across the population. I might show you Toyota and a Chevy Sprint, right? Without the spoiler, without the spoiler, right? Then you might say that's a 2 or something, right? Or you might say a 3. See, so you're basically just kind of going by the similarities that you see between the products, and you're saying which of these are kind of most alike or most dissimilar. So you can do it on either way. You can reverse score it, of course. And then on the attribute ratings, and that technique is basically different because that's more sort of like where you're giving them the attribute in terms of quality. Where do you rank this brand on a scale of 1 to 7? Then you kind of administer that whole process to get those attribute ratings. So these are sort of the pros and cons of these pairwise comparisons versus attribute ratings, right? So the attribute ratings often are used when you can kind of spell out which attributes are important to the markets that you're trying to go after. So this is giving you an example of how you might do this with like Crest toothpaste, right? So this is sort of getting at the idea of Crest toothpaste. And you might say, you know, check one of the blocks on this scale, you know, that's basically showing 7 points there, right? So in those 7 points, where does it fall in terms of whitens teeth? It does not whiten teeth. Or prevents tooth decay, and it does not prevent tooth decay. So you're kind of just getting them to kind of rate across each one of those by placing a mark. You can do these with marks, numbers, or whatever, right? Different survey techniques. And then you're basically trying to get at where your brand falls on each one of those versus other brands. So all of this starts with the whole idea of you formulate a problem, obtain the data, do the analysis, then you, in the similarity process, you have to kind of interpret the structure. So in the similarity process, you don't have the data that tells you what the dimensions are, right? See, I'm sort of starting with dimensions of, say, decay or whitens teeth in the attribute rating method. In the similarity method, I don't know that, so I'm going to use statistical analysis to kind of plot those things out and see kind of what's proximate. And then I overlay sort of the art part of that is often kind of me overlaying what's most alike about these brands that I see at this part of the plot. And then it's from knowing what's alike about brands and their position in a map that I can label, try to go back and kind of label what are those axes. So this set of slides will kind of show you how that's done a little bit. So this is perception versus, this is similarity data, right? Colgate versus Crest, Aquafresh versus Crest, Crest versus AIM, Colgate versus Aquafresh. And you're basically saying on a scale of 1 to 7, where do those pairwise comparisons work? So when I look at the data sort of might look something like this, right? So I have a data set, this is my database, and it's showing what's similar and dissimilar about those 2 different ones. So once I've got that data, then I'm trying to figure out, you know, I might know some of this other stuff. I might do attribute rating as well on the side, or I might just use similarity. I might just use what I know about the market and use that later to try to figure out kind of what these things are. So there's all sorts of statistical terms. You don't have to worry too much about what are these different stats terms and stuff like that that come into play. You don't have to worry too much about all of the statistics. You just want to see that there's a statistical process that's kind of going on behind the scenes to try to do a lot of this mapping kind of stuff. And the way statisticians would kind of do the analysis and look at it is really all these slides are showing, right? So the software would end up sort of generating this plot in the end, and we plot out these different things like where the brands are: Colgate, Gleam, AIM, Crest, Close-Up, Aquafresh.
What are some of the packages that do this kind of stuff?
You can do it in like SPSS has like a perceptual mapping. SAS has a perceptual mapping. There are a number of different just regular statistical software packages that will do mapping stuff. So once you kind of plot this out, this is an SPSS output, I believe. So once you kind of plot this stuff out, you look at you might overlay sort of data that you had on this, or you might basically kind of have it kind of draw the vectors, right? So you can have the software just draw the vectors and say, okay, put vectors on the space to try to figure out how are these proximate and how are they distant. So it might end up throwing those vectors out there, and then you end up sort of labeling those vectors with some other data, right? So you'd label the vectors in the similarity approach. You might label it like clean stains because you know that DentaGuard is really good at that. You might label it fights cavities because you know Colgate, Crest, and AIM are sort of focused on that. So see, the labeling is sort of the artistic part. Whitens teeth, you may know that that's sort of where Close-Up is positioned, right? So that's the similarity method. So this is just sort of how to get at how many axes you would have. Like, this is sort of the number of dimensions is the number of vectors that I showed on that last thing. So this is sort of the way statisticians would get at the number of dimensions. More statistics terms on how would you assess and aggregate it. Then aggregation, there are different aggregation techniques. You can do these basically by an individual, or you can do them sort of by grouping them together. And the way you aggregate is often driven by your research question of what group or what segment you may be trying to get at to try to analyze and understand it. And then this is just sort of a set of different pitfalls that get into that. So seeing sort of this is an example then of a 2D slide, right? Okay, so this is a two-dimensional map, and it's for ready-to-eat cereal, right? So I'm kind of switching over and looking at cereal now. And this is sort of what my similarity data may show as I look at it, right? So then what I'm going to add to that data are these things, right? See, I'm kind of adding the axes. I don't know where they are. I just look at them spatially, and I say, okay, what would the vertical line represent? What would the horizontal line represent? And so what I'm overlaying into that is I'm basically overlaying my understanding of the market. So I have to kind of have some art or some expertise to kind of do the labeling part of this process, right? So I have to be able to look at that and know, okay, from experience or whatever, that Fruit Loops, Lucky Charms, Frosted Flakes, those sorts of things, and Cheerios, Corn Chex, that the difference vertically is sort of the sugar content idea, right? So that's how you get the label for that one. So the horizontal content, who knows what that one is without looking at that? Okay, so it might be that it's related to price per ounce is what I was really thinking. Very good, Jeremiah. But it could have been fiber, right? So price per ounce, so you can see how there's an artistic part that you're just kind of overlaying on the labeling of the axes, right?
That makes it very subjective.
Yeah, so what have I talked about in marketing all along?
No, I understand, but you've always said that there's size that backs the subjectivity, right?
Yeah, I've talked about marrying both the science and the art, right? So the science part, the statistics, there's really nothing you're doing to that. The axes are there, those two dimensions are there. The art part is what do you label those, right?
What if somebody really labeled it as fiber content without taking into account?
I would have to look at the fiber content of these. It may not. It actually is shredded wheat, fiber, Wheaties. Wait, granola's got quite a bit of so when you go all the way to the left, I think that's got a lot of fiber on it. Right, Special K's got quite a bit of fiber. I don't think fiber works the more I look at it, right? So when I go horizontal, it sounded good. So see what I'm saying? So you have to kind of look at it individually and say, does that label make sense, right?
So these factor out of the stats like crystal enrollment kind of things or factor analysis. I mean, it's really doing them. Like what explains variance of something.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly what you're doing. You're just sort of trying to say it's factoring them out in the way that similarity and dissimilarity is placing them in this space, in two-dimensional space, the way they're related one to another based on that input or that data. And then once it's sort of taken that input or the data, then you know this is sort of where they're positioned based on sort of the Euclidean distance between one another. And then the issue becomes like, how do I label these two axes? That's exactly it.
But isn't the input in the data determined by those?
Not on one method it is, on the other method it's not, right? So that's kind of the two differences in the method. So in one method, I actually just asked them, on sugar content, where would you rate this brand? On price per ounce, so then I'm just getting at the attribute directly. On price per ounce, where would you rate this brand? On fiber content, where would you rate this brand on a scale of 1 to 7? Then on the attribute, so that's the attribute rating method. I have that up front. But on this method, the similarity dissimilarity method, the paired comparisons method, that's all the same, just one other alternative. I don't have that data up front.
It just says that Applejack's is really different from shredded wheat.
Yes, Applejack's is really different from shredded wheat. Yeah, those are kind of the maximally different two brands on that plot. And it says that these brands are sort of, the ones that are proximate to one another are kind of considered competitors one to another, right? So I'm only doing two-dimensional space, right? So when you go to L'Oreal, we're going to take, L'Oreal is going to do attribute rating methods, right? But it's going to do it in like 17-dimensional space. So see that. This is an overlay. So what this overlay is trying to say is you could take the overlay and you could take data that you have from the market. And you might know from that market data how big are the segments that exist. So this is often commonly what people do. Right? Is they'll take the segments and they say, okay, well within the cereal markets that we're interested in, we're going to overlay the segments. So each one of these circles sort of represents segments that are out there, right? So then if I'm looking at my brand, I know the segment sizes that exist and where the center of those segments are in this two-dimensional space, right? Then I've got some idea of like where I might want to move or reposition my brand, right? So I might say, okay, here's a big segment that's out there that's unattended. Maybe we want to move the brand towards that. Or we might be in a segment where there's lots of competition and we may not want to move towards that. If you're shredded wheat and you're trying to be in that green circle, congratulations, right? You're there.
So these segments get dropped on this two-dimensional space with some methodology, or that's also?
Yeah, so this would be sort of the same kind of stuff that Steve was sort of pulling out earlier, right? You split up the segments and you say, okay, where are they? And you find your two-dimensional information about those segments, and then you kind of have data on the segment from some pre-existing sample, or it could be your own sampling. You could do your own sampling to figure out where they are, where different people are, and their preferences for these different things. And then you project that out to try to figure out how big those segments are. So when we do conjoint analysis or trade-off analysis, we'll get at the same sort of thing. How do you kind of get segments from the sample itself?
So when you say we want to move into the product 19 segment there, you say we want to market shredded wheat there, or just make a new product and place it in that segment?
Yeah, so those are all the branding decisions that you're often making. So let's say you're Frosted Flakes and you meant to be in the red circle that's down where product 19 is, right? So if you this is all hypothetical. If you have the Frosted Flakes brand and it's already sort of centered up almost in that segment, you may say, well, I don't really want to move Frosted Flakes. I want to keep it where it is, but I want to do a different brand to kind of go after part of the share that maybe product 19 has, right? Because I can sort of create some of these associations that get after that segment maybe with a different name. So it becomes, what do I want people to associate with my brand? Might be those sorts of things. So what are some of the attributes that we just talked about in the Lenovo case? What might be two of the dominant attributes that you guys kind of brought up as you were going through that analysis?
Dependability.
Dependability. So I heard dependability came out a couple of times, right? So dependability might be one of the axes that's out there, right? So how would we collect the data that went into this before we did the two axes? How would we get that data? Okay, on this chart, so you could do that using the attribute rating method. Yeah, so if you did an attribute rating method, you just asked it on dependability, 1 to 10 or 1 to 7 or whatever your scale is. Where does Lenovo rank? So to get to dependability is sort of one of the explanations of where they separate. You might do all these other brands and try to figure out, okay, well, all these cheap brands are down at the bottom, all these great brands are up at the top, and then that would be an indicator that maybe the vertical axis was dependability, right? That's it. So that's how you get to the art part of it. So you're sort of overlaying what you know and understand about the brands into the analysis to try to figure out sort of why they come out the way they do.
So are the circles from other kinds of market research that say, this is our whatever demographic kind of segment who is, price conscious and prefers a low sugars? I mean,
yeah, they can be. Yeah,
they buy about this much cereal and this is the size in the U.S. or is it?
Yeah, that's right.
Or is it, so those it's still looking for. You're looking for research then of a broader segment of things that also picks up on the dimensions you identified as important.
Yeah, and like how mathematical or how qualitative that overlay is really up to the individual, right? So, like the individual may have a good quantitative analysis and a good study that gets at exactly these two dimensions, right? They may have a study that's done price per ounce and sugar content and figured out, mathematically if this sample is representative of the population of interest, what those circles are and how big each one of those circles would be on the map. Or they may have sort of just an intuitive understanding of where that is, right? So you can be very intuitive, you can be very artistic, or you can be very statistical. And sometimes it's a function of sort of what your resources are and what data you have available. But what you should see is sort of how would you go about, what I want you to see a lot is the pedagogy, right? So I want you to see the pedagogy is there. And then whether you're more like the fearsome foursome, the fabulous foursome, I'm still working on the foursome, right? Or Steve, is really sort of up to you. Are you going to be more quantitative? Or are you going to be more qualitative? That's a lot of times that's really up to you. And so entrepreneurs a lot of times have less data, less information, use more secondary stuff, use more secondary proxies to kind of figure out what are these segment sizes and how might they work. Okay, so but if you see sort of the pedagogy, that's a lot of what I want you to get out of the class is to think about what we're trying to get at is what do people associate with which brands and how big are those segments. So how do we figure out where we are and where we might want to go, right? So this last slide is just sort of a summary of some of the perceptual mapping stuff. So you'd sort of want to know there's an attribute rating method. That's sort of how that works. There's an overall similarity method, and that's kind of how that works. So that's probably a good slide to kind of know pretty well, right? I've actually asked that exact slide on exams before, for example. Okay. So one of the things that you're doing in the L'Oreal case is you're looking at a perceptual map. And that perceptual map looks a lot like this one. And when you look at your perceptual map, some of these cases don't have these things at the bottom. There are like 3 vectors that go down in figure or exhibit 9 that are unlabeled. Okay, so one of the questions that one of the examples I gave you for midterm exams is I like to give you a map like this and say interpret the map. Okay, so that's sort of your typical question. That's typically what you're doing when you see one of these maps. You're trying to interpret it. And that's really what the class is more about, right? So you're not kind of all hung up in the statistics when you're doing this, but you do want to think first about the vectors. You guys are good to go. Vectors are just lines with arrows on the end of them, right? So you want to think about the vectors, right? And sort of the relationship among the vectors. So geometrically, what are the relationships that might exist between 2 vectors, any 2 vectors? Okay, perpendicular. That's one. Same direction, parallel, right? Okay, very good. A vector has magnitude and direction. I love that. A vector that stuck with you forever. Yeah. So it will stick with these sorts of things will stick with you forever. The vectors have magnitudes and directions, right? Okay, so they could be these are kind of the 3 geometric relationships that you want to think about between the vectors: the perpendicular, the parallel, and sort of the 180, opposite directions, right? Those 3 things when you're interpreting the map, right? So So if I'm looking for the perpendicular one, where are two perpendicular ones on the map? Okay, good. That's the low-hanging fruit, right? Because I can kind of get a 90-degree angle that's sort of in there. But I also, you also want to see like 90-degree angles as you go all the way around, right? So that's kind of a 90-degree angle, but there are other like 90-degree angles, right? So you have to kind of think about it as the map rotates all the way around, right? So the ones that are easiest to see are going to, are basically the ones that you can kind of see in square or two-dimensional ways, right? But if you just kind of take if you take an angled object like this, right, you can kind of rotate around to each vector, and you're kind of looking for these, are there other 90-degree angles all the way around, right? So those are perpendicular, but what does perpendicular mean? Besides 90 degrees.
Dramatically different attributes? They're like...
Yeah, okay, so this basically is just interpreted as unrelated. Right? These are basically unrelated. They're uncorrelated. They're unrelated attributes, right? So there's something, one doesn't really have much to do with the other. So what about two that are pretty close together? Highly correlated, right? Okay, so what are some of the highly correlated attributes here? I'm sorry, these two, right? Okay, so these two are really close, right? So those are pretty close to parallel. So, yeah, over here, these two are really close, right? These are really close. So if I was doing sort of like a factor analytic technique, what I'm often trying to do is reduce the number of vectors that exist. So factor analysis is just trying to say I need to simplify this so I don't have 17 different vectors. So one of the things that I would do in that process is look at the vectors that are very close to parallel, and I might group those together. Because my brand can't score high on contains AHA without scoring high on exfoliates the skin. My brand can't score high on good value for the money without scoring high on face stays younger longer. See, I'm going to score high on both of those or score low on both of those vectors, right? So that's sort of one of the relationships that I look at, or the second relationship. So they're highly related, right? In stats, that's just correlated, uncorrelated, and highly correlated on the first two, right? So then the third relationship that you're looking for are like two vectors that move in opposite directions. Where are those? Technologically advanced and products mother uses. Okay, so they're going in totally opposite directions, right? So what does that mean? Trade-offs, right? So these are basically trade-offs, right? So my brand, if I score high on technologically advanced, I'm going to score low on products mother used, right? So see, those are basically trade-offs. What you try to do is you try to figure out, well, where does my brand and where do my competitors rank in that space? So how do I do that? Yeah, I'm going to do it straight from this map, though, right?
How far up they are from the origin?
Okay, so there are two things you can kind of do with this, right? You can say how far they are, or you can say I'm going to drop a perpendicular to the line. Okay, is it are those different interpretations? So I'm going to drop a perpendicular. So I always drop a perpendicular, actually. So if I'm going to go to technologically advanced, when I drop the perpendicular, I just kind of square up the perpendicular on Estee Lauder, right? And here it's actually kind of raising the perpendicular, but it's always called dropping the perpendicular, right? So I kind of drop the perpendicular to see where it kind of stacks up on that line, right? I bring Clinique up, and I see where Clinique is. I bring, that's L'Oreal Plenitude, that dot is, right? And so I'm dropping the perpendicular down to the line. And I can drop them all the way across, right? So the imaginary line goes through the origin. So if I'm still looking at technologically advanced, I'm dropping Pond's down to about there, right? And I'm dropping Olay kind of where it is. I pull Avon up to kind of about there. I've got alpha hydroxide I pull down to there, right? So which brand is most technologically advanced? Alpha hydroxide, right? So it's not the distance. That's one of the most important things to remember. It's not the distance to the line. It's once it's dropped onto that attribute or onto the line. It's sort of where it is most, whatever's most proximate to the arrowhead or that's on the line itself or on that attribute. So then you could do that across every attribute that's there. You're basically treating each attribute as sort of a number line to figure out where your brands rank on each one of those. Okay, so competition amongst brands. How do I figure that part out? Yeah, are they close together? So it really is just sort of that distance, right? It's just totally that distance, right? So these are pretty close. Those are pretty close. So these are really close, right? Okay, so then what do I know from the case data? That helps me with sort of the size of the segments that might exist. I see where my competition is, but what I want to know now is I want to overlay segments onto this thing somehow, right? So how might the case data help me to overlay segments? See, it's not always just as straightforward where it's already kind of graphed out and everything, right? Yes. How would you?
They were saying if you look specifically at the American market, I can't recall the exact numbers, but they said that most people use overlay. That's number one, so probably has a
Okay, so there's probably a big circle somewhere over here near oil of Olay, right? What about ponds? Big brand, small brand? There's a big circle somewhere on this side of the chart, right? See, I'm sort of getting there by knowing sort of what the brands are, by knowing the segment sizes that exist, right? So I've got some idea that there's a lot of market over on this side. But see, I know these sorts of things. What about on the right-hand side? Where are some of the segments? We know some of the stuff that's there that's in those segments. So one of the things you have to get at is you have to get at this idea of how big are the segments, how big are the different segments. There are really three segments in the case, right? Okay, treatment. Okay, so treatment's sort of its own category, right? So breaking those numbers down becomes complicated in the case because of one major difference in the way the numbers are presented. Dollar share versus unit share. So that's kind of a big tip. Pay attention to sort of dollar share versus unit share in the numbers that are there. It gets pretty tricky. It takes a lot of work to try to get at how big are the different segments and how well are the different players doing in those segments. So you want to spend some time with some of that analysis to try to sort out that. And you'll have to use things like the pricing data that's in the back to try to convert from some of the units over to try to get different shares and stuff like that. Okay, what does dollar share mean? Share the dollars, right? So when you read that chart, there's an exhibit that's in the case that confuses a lot of people. But if you read it literally what it says, dollar share, you'll be good to go. Because people will read that a lot of times in different ways. So you want to sort of see what you're looking at. Make sure you're interpreting the exhibits well. Other questions about L'Oreal? Okay, so the maps are sort of being used in the L'Oreal case to help them to make different decisions. So the maps are just part of it. So that's part of what I want you to see is sort of how do you take some of these tools, understand the tools, and then see how they're used to make these positioning decisions, right? And these positioning decisions, you should see those as being kind of highly correlated with branding and brand management.
All the best with your efforts to master marketing and sales. I'm Gary Hunter, and I hope you have a great day.